All right. Thank you, everybody. It's great to be here. This is the first time I've been in Lisbon, and I'm enjoying your beautiful city. I have a lot of material to cover, so I'm going to get started right away. If you want to follow along, I'm going to be tweeting while I talk at Griggs_talks. And after the event, my normal Twitter handle is just @Griggs. The slides are already up on SpeakerDeck, so you can look at them at your leisure. Don't worry about that. Today, I want to talk to you about a puzzle that I've been looking at, a puzzle that I think impacts the way that we build things for the web, a puzzle that is indicative of a problem, sort of a misconception we have about the web, and one that impacts us now, we just don't realize it yet. And I started puzzling about this when I was looking into browsers on TV. I was doing a lot of research into what it would be like for us to design interfaces that would work on televisions if Apple released a TV product that had a browser. And there were a lot of interesting things that I found out in that. But if I were just to look at a couple of the highlights, the first was that designing for something that was on the wall across the room from you is very different than designing for something that's in your hand or on your desk. And that seems really obvious, but there are a couple of sort of key ways that it's different. The first is that you need larger text and fewer words. And the other, probably more interesting for us, is that we have to design something that exists on a grid so that it becomes obvious to somebody what happens when they go left, right, up, down, these sorts of actions. And as I learned more about what it would be to build for a TV, I started to wonder, well, really, I need to build something that's a different design. How do I know what is a TV? And it seems like a really obvious question, right? It's that thing that's on the wall. But in reality, this is HD TV. Now, it's not a television, but it is the exact same resolution as an HD TV. So what this tells us is that resolution does not define the optimal user experience. In responsive design, I've seen people create diagrams that show sort of this continuum from a mobile device to a tablet to desktop, and then they throw televisions at the end of that continuum because they're bigger. But in reality, the resolution of that device is actually somewhere in that desktop range. It may be less than somebody's cinema display. The second thing that started me looking at input and adaptive input was actually something related to responsive web applications. We were asked by a client whether they could take one of their applications and make it responsive. And there are a lot of people who were arguing at the time that you cannot, and are still arguing for that matter, that you cannot make applications responsive. Now, I believe that responsive design for apps is inevitable. At the time, I wasn't so certain about it, but now I believe absolutely that it's inevitable. And I believe that it's inevitable because of the fact that the lines between device classes are absolutely blurring. So on this table, you see a series of large phones and small tablets. And the thing to look at is that column on the far right, the viewport column. And there's not much difference between the viewport sizes of small tablets and large phones. As a matter of fact, if I just put these numbers on the screen, I doubt that any of you can tell which ones are phones and which ones are tablets. Now I'll admit that I cheated a little. I actually put the tablets in portrait mode and the phones in landscape mode, but does nobody ever rotate their device? Like, the reality is that the lines between the device classes are blurring, and even if we had a project where the only thing we had to do were to design a web interface that worked on phones, the differences between the size of the screen on like a BlackBerry Bold and the size of the screen on the Samsung Galaxy Mega is significant enough that you would need to use responsive design to be able to design for that interface. I think of this as this blurring that really, every time we try to draw a line around a particular device class, that it is much like a literal line in the sand. If you pause for a moment, it starts to blur. If you look away, it's gone. So that is one of the reasons why I think responsive application design is inevitable. When I was looking at this problem for this project, what we had an application that the company had created using Telerik's JavaScript UI widgets. And in particular, they had this grid format. And we were trying to figure out how they could continue to build something like that, given the fact that that particular widget framework was going away. And so I started looking at other JavaScript UI widgets. And what I saw was this pattern. We had JavaScript, or jQuery Mobile and jQuery UI. We've got XJS and and Sencha Touch. We've got Dojo Mobile and Dojo Desktop. Like this real clear division between desktop and mobile. None of them really responsive. I started wondering why this was the case. And thankfully, Todd Anglin with Dojo, or with Kendo UI, had written about why he felt that their tablet UI and their mobile UI needed to be different. And he talked about the fact that it's not that they're technically incapable of doing this, but that they believe that a phone UI to a tablet UI is not so dissimilar from trying to automatically adapt desktop UI to phone. They're fundamentally different platforms with different usability considerations. And the thing that I thought was really interesting about this wasn't that he thought that tablet and phone were very different. Although, given what we just looked at in terms of the resolutions of those devices, we should question that. But that he thought that it was so obvious that desktop was different than phone that he could use that as an analogy to argue why tablets are different than phones. It's so apparent to us, so intuitive to us, that we would never question that phone is different than desktop. I think that it's sometimes really hard for us to envision what the responsive version of applications would be when we think about things that are like spreadsheets, stuff that we're accustomed to typing with and building and sort of doing these productivities. We want people to be productive. We want them to remain in a flow, and that seems so incredibly different than what it's like to be playing on an iPad. For both the TV and for these desktop web applications, I believe that input matters much more than resolution. The grid in that TV design is important because of the D-pad. Because the D-pad doesn't allow a person to just pick up their finger and select an arbitrary point on the screen or move their mouse to some other touch target or some other target on the screen that they're going to click on. Instead, we need to know what is currently selected, and we need to be able to know what will happen when we press left, right, up, down. It needs to be absolutely clear to the user. The D-pad, the input, dictates that design. The same thing is true, I think, in responsive apps, that this is what we think of as being productivity. This is what we think of as desktop, and so consequently, we think of desktop designs in a certain way. A couple of years ago, Jeremy Keith started talking about how we had looked at the web and thought that it was a particular size. That we said that the web was 640 by 480, and we deemed it good. And then at some point, we looked at our analytics, and we said enough users were doing 800 by 600 that maybe we could move to 800 by 600. And then eventually, we got to the point where it was 1024 by 768, and that was so much screen real estate. It was really awesome. But that was a consensual hallucination. That is the phrase that Jeremy used. He borrows it from William Gibson. And I love this because it is, in truth, consensual. This is not simply an illusion that's been pulled over our eyes. It's an illusion that we buy into because it makes our lives easier. It's much easier for us to believe that the web is a fixed canvas than to realize that the web doesn't have a canvas and never actually had a canvas. Even our tools perpetuate this lie. They provide us with interfaces like in Photoshop where you select preset web definitions and it provides you with resolutions for that. I think we've made tremendous progress in this regard. We've started to learn quite a bit about what it means to design across the continuum and not to be fixed on a particular screen size. But there's another consensual hallucination that we haven't really started to address, and that's this idea that, in fact, desktop equals keyboard and mouse, and that phones equal touch. And in the same way in which the consensual hallucination was never true for screen size, this isn't true. This isn't true now. Because we have phones that have pointer events, that have cursors that have hover? Right? We talk about hover being dead, but in fact, there are phones that have hover. We have phones that have keyboards, right? Unless you think that it's only these like non-Apple products, you can have an iPhone with a keyboard. This is a Bluetooth keyboard case that slides out and provides a keyboard. It's easy for us to forget that at the keynote that Steve Jobs introduced the iPad, he also introduced a keyboard for use with the iPad. I've been in client meetings where every person at the client organization had a keyboard and an iPad, except for me, and I was using paper. I felt so out of place. But like a lot of people do this. And that's just the start of it. I mean, like, what are these things? Are they tablets or are they laptops? Well, kind of depends, right? Depends. I mean, they could be both. I actually am really envious of this design. I was recently on a flight, and now in the United States, like on ascent and descent, you can use tablets, but you can't use laptops. And I was getting a lot of work done, and then they say, hey, we're starting to descend. You need to put your laptops away. And I was just thinking, man, if I could just detach that keyboard, I could actually continue working. That would be so nice. And we've also got desktop computers, 23-inch, Dell computers with touchscreens, an Asus monitor that it has a touchscreen and also doubles as an Android computer. So these devices exist. I think Luke really nailed it in this diagram that he shows sort of what we're designing for is a continuum of input, a continuum of screen resolutions. And more than anything, what this has taught me is that we can no longer make assumptions about input based on screen size or form factor, and frankly, we never should have. I think input represents a bigger challenge than screen size, and it's changing more rapidly than ever before at a pace that's hard to keep up with. So I want to take a quick, closer look at some of the things that are coming from an input perspective, and then talk a little bit about what it means to design for input that's changing. So let's take a look and start with some of the fun stuff. Let's start with the futuristic things and talk about voice. Now, Siri gets all the hype because Apple is good at promoting things, but Siri, frankly, sucks. At least it does for me. Maybe it's great in Portugal, but it sucks for me. I think Microsoft and Google both have much more compelling products. Microsoft, with Xbox One, has really interesting voice controls. As a matter of fact, you can control Internet Explorer with voice.
Where it says Browse to Website, say the website's name. Browse to Bing. Say click on and read the text of a link to follow it. For example, those navigation headers along the top of the screen. Click on More. Click on Rewards. Go back. Scroll down. Click on Translator app. Go back. Scroll up. Click on Travel. The usual gestures work in Internet Explorer too, like grab and drag to move around a web page, and press and release to follow links. There's also a couple of unusual ones. Grab and pull to zoom into a web page, and grab and push to zoom back out.
I love that because the other ones are totally usual, right? Like, those are the unusual ones.
To open the address bar, grab it down at the bottom of the screen and pull up. When you're done, leave Internet Explorer by pressing the Xbox button on your controller to go back home.
So, really, really cool stuff. And I find myself wondering, like, what it's going to be like if we start seeing a lot of uptick in usage of voice-controlled applications. Like, what would it mean to start designing things, designing web pages that work with voice? A lot of what I end up writing and linking to, I end up excerpting pretty large segments of what somebody's written and making that the link. And that would be pretty onerous if you actually had to speak aloud those two sentences that I'm linking to. One of the things that I think is also clear is if this ever took off, we could finally kill all of those people, or not kill the people, but kill kill the links that they want to create that are click here links, because click on, click here, right? Like, we'd finally have an argument that would end that forever. If we move over and look at Google, Google has some stuff that you could actually integrate into your applications, which is really neat. So their voice control, which you can see if you're using Chrome on desktop or if you use it on your phone, is really, really good. And you can, you can speak whatever it is, and the more words you say, it actually recognizes and does a better job. And this is actually an API that you can integrate into your application. So you could bring in speech recognition using the speech recognition API, progressively enhance and use it. What about gestures? There are a couple of, I think, really interesting gesture inputs coming down the pipe. Many of you have probably seen Leap. Do any of you own a Leap by chance? Oh, quite a few of you. Yeah, I've heard that they're interesting, but they're sort of beta, right? Like, they don't work quite as well. And frankly, after I saw Ring as a Kickstarter project, I realized that I wouldn't, that I kind of feel like Leap is a little limited because it's stuck to the computer. Ring is really cool. Have you seen this?
Ring is a wearable input device which will allow you to control almost anything. You just need to wear the ring and tap on the side to start your gesture. Ring captures and analyzes your gesture inside of it and sends the data to your smart devices. Vibration and LED notifies you of status updates and notifications. Each application has its own unique gesture mark, so when you want to use it, simply perform the designated action. Gesture marks can also be edited, making customization simple and easy. To control home appliances, simply sync a ring to them using your smart devices. You can connect directly or by using the hub.
That's really cool. I love this. This is Josh Clark was talking recently about how these sorts of interactions are magical. Like, they're truly magical. We're making gestures in the air, and things at a distance are interacting. Like, really amazing stuff coming. It's unfortunately too new to know yet what, if anything, this will mean for people building on the web. So let's move back from that futuristic stuff and go back to something a little dumber. Go back to our old friend, the D-pad. One of the really interesting things I learned when I was doing the research in televisions was that any of the browsers that actually supported D-pads inside the browser sent arrow keys as the actual key events when somebody used the D-pad. Now, this isn't a standard as far as I can tell, but it is a de facto standard. So I started thinking about how nice it would be if I were building a TV interface to just simply say, hey, if there's a remote control, then support the arrow keys. Easy, right? Except here's the thing. Remote controls are undetectable. And it turns out this is kind of a theme for input. So let's look at a couple more inputs that we have access to today that I don't think we're using enough of. So we've got access to the camera, and we're getting access to it in the browser, and we can do stuff with the camera. Really amazing things. I see in the native side a lot of experimentation going on in this space, but not as much on the web, and I think we can do a better job on that. Geolocation, we do a good job of, which is really great. We've also got access to the gyroscope and the accelerometer, but very little use of that. I'm not certain how we'd use it, but I find myself thinking a lot about what the different sensors are and the inputs and how we might be able to utilize them. But if we go back to today's problems and look at this divide between what we think of as desktop and what we think about as mobile and why we think of them as different, I think that it boils down to these sorts of things. That on desktop, we have hover state, and on phones, we have no hover state. even though we know that this isn't necessarily true. That on desktop, that typing is easier and that it's harder on a phone. This, I would argue, is categorically not true. In the United States, 25% of people who access the mobile web either infrequently or never access it on a desktop computer. I would assert that for them, if you put them in front of a QWERTY keyboard, they probably will be substantially slower than they are on their phones. And I believe that even for those of us who are really fast touch typists, if you're in a situation like on an airplane and the person in front of you has declined or reclined their seat and you no longer have room to use a laptop, the virtual keyboard on your iPad or your tablet is probably a better keyboard interface for you than a physical keyboard. This is 100% true, that having a mouse means higher precision, means we can have smaller targets, and that touch equals that means that we need to have bigger targets. And then finally, the fact that we've got right-clicking on mouse and we've got gestures on the iPad. And you can see how these assumptions influence the interfaces, right? You can look at any of those libraries, any of those frameworks, and you can see how they translate into the designs. So jQuery Mobile has larger interfaces, larger text, and jQuery UI, these smaller things. And so what you end up at, or at least I ended up at, was this point where I said, OK, well, fine. I'll just detect if there's a touch screen, and I'll provide a different interface based on it. But here's the thing. There's no way to reliably detect whether or not a touch screen is present. As a matter of fact, Google has talked about making touch events, turning on touch events for all browsers, regardless of whether or not there's a touch screen. And they want to do this because they figure that at some point somebody could connect a touch screen. Just because there's no touch screen at the moment doesn't mean that there might not be one in the future. I started working on this talk by creating this spreadsheet of all these different types of input and starting to look at what the standards were for them, how you detect them, what the APIs were, and things like this. And I started finding really interesting stuff like, hey, can you detect a mouse? Not reliably. Well, what about a keyboard, right? Surely we can detect a keyboard. Nope. Here's the thing. This is the real lesson, is that input is transient. The presence of input at one moment does not mean that that input will be used in the next moment. And because of that fact, we can't rely on evidence in the past to let us know what the next piece of input is. And just because we haven't seen a touch screen doesn't mean that the next interaction isn't going to be a touch screen. I want to show you a short video that Boris did, Boris from the Chrome team, when he first got a Chromebook Pixel, which has a touchscreen laptop.
This experiment shows switching between mouse and touch mode on a touchscreen laptop. When I use the touchscreen, the buttons get bigger. When I switch to mouse, they get smaller. This experiment shows adding markers to a map via the touchscreen and navigating the map by panning and zooming using the trackpad. In this experiment, I can manipulate an object on the screen by a combination of selection via the touchscreen and manipulation via the trackpad. One finger rotates the object and 2 fingers scales it.
There are a couple of things that I think are really interesting about that video. The first is that that first experiment is probably what most of us, or at least I, would have done the first time I attempted to create an interface that allowed for touchscreens, right? If I can detect a touch screen, let's make it a touch interface. But what that video shows is that that's actually a poor experience. Because what happens is instead of just tapping once to select something, I have to tap twice in order to do it. The second thing is that that last experiment really shows that instead of thinking about these things as a either-or situation, it can sometimes actually be all together. That we may actually have both touchscreens and keyboard and mouse all working together, and that the combination of them can actually be a better experience than what we have with just one of them. Because of this, I've started to think that we need to become more zen about input. Josh Clark, who's pictured here, wrote about how after using a Windows 8 laptop for a while, that he felt that every desktop UI should be designed for touch now. When any desktop machine can have a touch interface, we have to proceed as if they all do. Luke, in a series of videos for Intel, had put together this graph showing what happens if you do something that's keyboard first, keyboard mouse first, versus doing something that's touch first, in terms of control sizes, target size, that sort of stuff. And the point that he makes is that if you do something that's keyboard mouse first, people using their fingers won't be able to interact with it. But if you do something that's touch first, all you'll be doing is making it easier for people using keyboard and mice as well because of Fitt's law. Larger targets are easier to hit, a law that existed because of mice. What do we do about these people who have their power interfaces and really want like that desktop power interface? I think one option is that we give them choice. And I look to an example from Gmail as a way that this might work out. Gmail has display density controls. So by default, you've got a comfortable display density control, and then you've got compact, and you've got other options. Now, comfortable is really touch-friendly, but it's not called the touch-friendly interface. You can select either comfortable, and if you're on a laptop that's a touch laptop, you could actually select compact if you wanted to be able to see more information on the display. Another example is the Vimeo couch mode. So Vimeo has the ability, if you scroll up on their web page, to go into a couch mode. And this mode actually looks really great when you're at a 10-foot, I'm sorry for the American measurement, viewing distance. But there's nothing preventing you from using this on your laptop. It's actually really nice sometimes. Or if you've got a Mac Mini connected to your TV. Or if you're on your TV in the browser, you can actually get out of couch mode and go to the standard view. These are just modes that you're flipping between. And the thing that's nice about that is that when you're doing this, you're designing for user need, not for a specific form factor or input. Or worse yet, designing for an input incorrectly based on an assumption that you've made because of the form factor, right? When I started looking at this, I realized that there wasn't really a language to describe this. Nobody was really talking about these challenges of having transient input. And I started talking about it in terms of progressive input. But I realized that felt wrong in a lot of ways. And it felt wrong because even though we're using a lot of progressive enhancement techniques to adapt to input, progressive enhancement contains an argument that says that with better browsers, you get a better experience. And who are we to judge input? I actually think that the fact that we judge input is one of the things that gets us in trouble in the first place. That we view certain types of input as being superior to others causes us to build interfaces around those and assume that people won't want to do things on what we deem to be inferior forms of input. What we really need to do is we need to learn to adapt. We need to learn to adapt to whatever type of input is present. We also need to learn to let go of those illusions that comfort us. And if we go back to the things that Ethan wrote about in his List Apart article on responsive design, and really going back to what John Alsop was writing about with the Tao of web design, we need to learn to accept the ebb and flow of things. And we've been learning to accept that from a screen resolution perspective, but it's also true from an input perspective. Now, this is the web as it should be, the web as it wants to be, the web in its natural state. More importantly, it's what our users expect. And when we do this, we build applications, we build sites, we build things that are more resilient, that are more future-friendly. And thank you very much.